Okay, so I've been working on this theory of it's not even only my theory, but it's actually some of my research. It's about understanding the soul's source, the root of the soul, and how sometimes various traits and things skip a generation or they pass down successfully a generation. It's a portion of genetic research. Because there's a simple theory that says, nature versus nurture, the culture's experience, how much does it influence on genetics, and what traits can recede and or be accentuated based on various scenarios, and the research associated with that. So in other words, so the theory says, well, sometimes the trait can be available genetically 2 to 3 generations, basically. So like your grandfather's and your great grandfather's traits, you can potentially access some of those things for various scenarios, just depending on the scenario, but so from genetically, that's mostly so if it's a great grandfather trait, mostly that's enhanced by various scenarios potentially, or receded by scenarios basically. If it's a grandfather's traits, most likely available, and then obviously father and mother's traits are most likely more readily, from a genetic standpoint. So in other words, so for example, like if your great grandfather had super strength, you could technically access that potentially if need be, and also emotional traits, behavioral traits, things of that sort. So for example, if so one of my grandmothers was like emotional at times, but my grandfather was not, because of his job, and he refused to let people speak Spanish in the context of their home. One of my grandfathers was fluent in Espanol, and because of his job with the U.S. Air Force, being a chief master sergeant and things like that, he disallowed my 3 aunts and my mother from speaking Spanish and learning Spanish and speaking Spanish. It just was the decision that he made, and so on and so forth. So that may have influenced that. Now, that's a cultural norm that was not passed down successfully, basically, and that influenced my personal life and the life of my mother and my 3 aunts. With that being said, from a genetic standpoint, let's say there was an emotional, a genetic trait that was, deemed as whatever, and most likely it may have been passed down a smidge to the next generation genetically. So you'd have to analyze, well, what happened with the four people? What were the reasonings? So maybe 1 out of the 4 may have had a slight similar genetic trait as their mother. Not an exact match, but a closer match. But the next generation after that, my generation would have, if you had 8 kids, there might be 1 with a tiny bit of the genetic trait of their grandmother, basically. So for example, if you have Alzheimer's, if your great grandfather has Alzheimer's, the most likely a person in the current generation would not. It would be unreasonable to assume. It would just be absurd to say that. Now, if your father has Alzheimer's, it's a little bit more. But so, for example, if there was a misinterpretation of Alzheimer's in the previous generation due to just ignorance or perhaps for other reasons, it would be a misinterpretation of a complete misunderstanding of genetics. So, like my cousins and things like that, and so on and so forth. Anyways, until next time, over and out.